Hey, welcome back. Now I'm really excited about today's video because I have a new toy in the shop to tell you about. This is the Leigh D4R Pro Dovetail Jig. Now this is one of the highest rated dovetail jigs currently on the market, and as my bank account can attest to, it's also one of the most expensive. So you may be wondering, is it really worth the additional cost if there are other dovetail jigs on the market that are a fraction of the cost? Now, I'm going to take you through the setup and operation of this jig to make a simple dovetail box. Along the way, I'm going to show you some of the things I like, but also a few features that I don't like about this jig so that you can decide for yourself if it's the right jig for you. So with that, let's go cut our materials for our box. Now when cutting the parts for our box, we need to make sure that everything is perfectly square. So I'm using my crosscut sled and a stop block to get everything to the right length and make sure the ends are square. So here I have my front and back, my two sides, and have this extra fifth piece, which is a piece of scrap of the same material, so it's the exact same thickness. We'll use this to calibrate our dovetail jig and our router bit to get perfectly fitting dovetails. And once all of your parts are cut out, we need to label what is going to be the inside and outside faces of our box so that when we cut the pins and tails, they are in the right direction. Now the manual for Leigh jig has a pictogram that they use, has a box and a triangle showing inside face and outside face. To me, that's just overly complicated. If this is the outside face of my box, I'm just going to put an O. The inside face, it's getting an I, so now I know inside versus outside. So mark all your box pieces before you head over to the jig. Now the setup for the jig is pretty simple. It's just mounted to a piece of plywood and that is clamped to the edge of my workbench. Here on the top I have another piece of plywood. This is just a spacer board that is used to register this finger assembly so it always comes back into the same location. Now the really ingenious thing about this jig is this finger assembly. Now this can be used to make half blind dovetails or through dovetails. And to switch between the modes, it's as simple as flipping over the jig end for end. Here we're in through dovetail mode, flip it over, and this goes into half blind dovetail mode. Get it back, just flip it end for end, and we're back into through dovetails. So to set up to make our box, we have our finger assembly set up in through dovetail mode and it's set to the pins side. Now we're going to take our tails board and with the inside facing towards us, mount it into the jig. I'm going to make sure that it registers against the stop on the left side and registers against the bottom of the fingers. Now with these cam locks, you want to make sure that you don't have these too tight. It takes very little pressure to get these to hold. Now the really unique thing about this jig that you don't have with much cheaper jigs is the ability to adjust the number and the spacing of our pins and tails. For example, for the width of this board, I can have it set up to have 5 dovetails, or I can have it set up to have one massive dovetail and anything in between. You can also adjust the size of the dovetail or the size of the pins by moving the individual fingers. So this is the pattern that I decided I want to go with. I'm going to have 4 dovetails and my center pin is going to be slightly larger than the others. As soon as you have the pattern that you like, just tighten down all of the fingers so that they don't move. Now don't forget that we put our tails board in here, so we're going to be cutting tails. So once you have your fingers set, flip it back over into tails mode before you start cutting with the router. And speaking of the router, now it's time to get our router set up so we can start making some dovetails. All right, so I've installed the guide bushing and the dovetail bit that comes with the jig. Now this bushing is not perfectly round, so it's a little bit oblong. So you want to make sure that this number 10 lines up with the center line of your router between the handles. Now we're going to take our scrap board and set it right underneath the fingers here so that we can mark a line on our tail board that indicates the thickness of our pin board. And we're going to use that to establish the depth of our router bit. When you're setting your bit depth, you want to try to cut your pencil line in half. That leaves you just enough material to clean everything up once you get the box glued together. So now we're done with the setup and we can route our dovetails just following the guides. Once you've completed this side of the tails board, flip the board over, making sure that the inside is still facing towards you, and route the other side as well. And if you're doing multiple boxes or drawers that are all the same size, you can route all of your tails boards at the same time before moving on to the next step. Once all of our tails are cut, now it's time to do our pins. To do this, we just need to switch over our finger assembly from the tails mode to pins mode. You want to line up the scale so it corresponds with the diameter of the dovetail bit that you're using. It's a good idea to aim for slightly too tight when you're setting up for your dovetails. That way you can work your way into the perfect fit. If you take too much off to begin with, you can't put the wood back, but you can always adjust and take away more. Now I'm going to put the extra scrap piece into the jig, and this time I'm going to have the outside facing towards me. And just like before, I'm going to take another board and mark the depth of our pins. Now we just need to swap out the dovetail bit in our router for the straight bit, and we can set it to the proper depth of cut using the line we made. And now we can route the pins on one side of our test board and see how we did. And I learned my lesson from doing the tails. I'm wearing my dust mask this time. Overall, that wasn't too bad. I don't know if you noticed, but I did get some tear out when I cut that first set of pins. But I quickly adjusted my technique and I started taking a light skim cut across the line, and that was preventing the tear out. So with our test board cut, let's get our tails boards and do a test fit, see how we did. Line these up. That. It's a good thing we tried to go for just a little too tight, because that's pretty much perfect right there where we're at. If we had tried to hit it bang on the money first time, it probably would have been a little bit too loose. So always aim for the joints being a little too tight the first pass, and you can always take away more, but if you cut away too much, you can't put the wood back. So I like this result, so I'm going to go ahead and cut the rest of all of our pin boards. So, and with that, we have a finished dovetail box. So, what are my thoughts on the D4R Pro dovetail jig? Well, I can say that this is the fastest and easiest dovetail box I've ever made. I've used several other methods. This is definitely going to get you there the quickest. So some of the things that I like, it is pretty easy to use. It's fairly simple and straightforward. It's not overly complex, but it does have a lot of great adjustability. The repeatability is great. Once you have this thing set up, you can blast through all of your drawer parts. This is especially good if you're doing a lot of boxes or drawers that are the exact same size. Okay, so what do I not like about this jig? Well, this is where I'm probably going to be a bit more harsh and a little more picky, because there are a number of things that I just did not like about the jig. Number one, the first thing I had to do when I got this jig and started to set it up was to build this base mounting board to be able to clamp it to my workbench so it doesn't slide around and move while I'm trying to cut my dovetails. This is something that could have been engineered into the jig itself. However, they didn't do that, I'm assuming to probably save money on the billet material that they use to make the jig out of, or maybe they didn't want the hassle of something that stick out there and someone drops it, breaks it off, and then they have a warranty claim. So I think I understand why they didn't do it. I just thought it was a bit of a hassle to have to cut a board and mount the jig to just to be able to clamp it down when they know that that's something that you're going to have to do to use the jig anyway. The other thing I don't like are these plastic cams. Now these work fine, but these feel very light and very flimsy. As long as you're using light pressure, you should be fine. But if you ever really crank down on these things, I definitely feel like these are going to break. I'm not sure how good the long-term durability is, but I do have some concerns with these cams just based on just how light and flimsy they feel. Another really big issue I have with this jig is dust collection, or the complete lack of dust collection. Now there is an add-on accessory that does offer dust collection, but you have to purchase that extra on top of the jig. Now, as something that is sold as the Pro version, I would expect to have the dust collection included. I think it really should be on something like this that is a premium jig. So with all that said, is this jig worth the premium cost? Well, it depends. So if you run a production shop where you're making lots of boxes for drawers or cases, a dovetail jig like this is going to be extremely valuable for you. It's going to save a ton of time rather than having to hand cut all of those dovetails or even use other machine methods, just because of the repeatability factor that you have and how quickly you can change out your parts to cut from dovetails to your pins. So for me, the pros definitely outweigh the negatives in this case. So this is something that I'm very happy to have in my shop. If you have any additional questions, please leave a comment below. I'll make sure and get to it and answer anything that I can. Thanks for watching. Please make sure you go check out some of my other videos. Make sure and subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you next time.